In December of 1980, a 20-year-old woman sat in a Missouri state hospital and wrote her parents a Christmas letter. She'd been arrested 5 weeks earlier for a murder she had not committed. She was under 3 antipsychotic medications at the time. Her handwriting was uneven. She apologized in the first paragraph for not being able to hold the pen the way she wanted to. The sentence she wrote to her family in the second paragraph of that letter would be, in retrospect, the most accurate statement anyone made about her case for the next 43 years. "Even if I am innocent," she wrote, "they want to put somebody away so they can say the case is solved." Her name was Sandra Hemme. She would not walk out of a Missouri prison again until she was 64 years old. The case that Missouri needed to solve, on the day Sandra wrote that letter, was the murder of Patricia Jeschke. Patricia was 31. She was small, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who had quietly built a life in her hometown and had never particularly wanted to leave it. She worked at the St. Joseph Public Library as a secretary. She had been born in St. Joseph. She had gone to school in St. Joseph. She went to a church in St. Joseph, where she had attended weekly meetings of a women's fellowship group for nearly a decade. She lived alone in a second-floor apartment on Masani Street, a quiet residential block, 3 blocks from the library where she worked. Neighbors heard her practicing piano on weekends. Her mother, who lived a short drive across town, called her most evenings to check in. On the evening of November 12, 1980, Patricia left the library at 5 o'clock. She stopped at a grocery store on her way home. She bought milk, bread, and 2 cans of soup. A clerk at the grocery store would later tell police that she had been pleasant, as she always was, and that she had seemed rushed only because she had a church meeting at 7. She did not arrive at the church meeting. Her mother, failing to reach her by phone the next morning, drove over to the apartment with a spare key. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. The groceries Patricia had bought the night before were on the kitchen counter, the milk warm, the bread still in its paper bag. Patricia was on the bedroom floor. She had been beaten. She had been stabbed. A pair of pantyhose had been used to strangle her. Her hands had been bound behind her back with a telephone cord that had been cut from the wall. On the kitchen counter, next to the groceries, her purse had been emptied. Her wallet was gone. Her credit card was missing. The St. Joseph police opened the case on November 13th. They arrived at the apartment within an hour of her mother's call. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed the people who had known Patricia. And then, on the same afternoon, a detail surfaced in their case notes that should have redirected the entire investigation. A man had tried to use Patricia's credit card at a jewelry store in Kansas City, Missouri, 50 miles south of St. Joseph. He had been turned away because the card had already been reported stolen by Patricia's bank after it was flagged in a routine overnight check. The clerk remembered him. Store records identified him. 2 St. Joseph detectives were on the scene within 3 hours of being notified. The man was Michael Holman. He was 33 years old. He was a police officer. He worked for the St. Joseph Police Department, in the same building where the murder investigation had begun that morning. Holman's alibi for the night of Patricia's murder was that he had been in a motel room with a woman named Mary. He said that they had met in a bar earlier that evening. He said that they had spent several hours in the room. He said that he could not remember the room number or the last name of the woman or the name of the bar where he had met her. The motel manager did not remember seeing him. Mary was never produced. No one was ever able to confirm she existed. A white pickup truck had been spotted near Patricia Jeschke's apartment on the day she died. 2 separate witnesses had described the truck to responding officers on November 13th. The description, a late 1970s white Ford, primer on the passenger side door, an oversized toolbox in the bed, matched Michael Holman's personal vehicle. A week after the murder, before his colleagues had finished doing what they should already have done, Holman resigned from the St. Joseph Police Department. He cited personal reasons. He did not return his uniform. He left the city within days. Several weeks later, officers searching his home on an unrelated matter, a follow-up on a domestic disturbance call from a neighbor, found in a drawer in his bedroom a pair of gold earrings in the shape of horseshoes. Patricia's father was brought in to look at them. He identified them without hesitation. He had bought them for his daughter 2 years earlier as a birthday gift. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, at the request of the St. Joseph Police, examined hair samples that had been collected from Patricia's bedsheets at the crime scene. The forensic report, dated February of 1981, indicated microscopic similarities to hair samples that had been obtained separately from Michael Holman. None of this information, the credit card in Kansas City, the white pickup truck near the apartment, the horseshoe earrings in Holman's drawer, the FBI hair report matching his samples, would be shared with the defense of the woman the state of Missouri was, by the time that FBI report arrived, already preparing to charge with the murder. On the day Patricia Jeschke's body was found, Sandra Hemme was a patient at the St. Joseph State Hospital. She was 20 years old. She'd been in and out of psychiatric care since the age of 15. Her diagnoses had shifted with the years, and the doctors. At various points, she had been described as schizophrenic, as suffering from major depressive disorder, as showing signs of post-traumatic stress. She had attempted suicide more than once. She had spent long stretches in institutional settings because her family, caring for her at home, had not been able to manage the cycles of her illness. On the days immediately before and after the murder of Patricia Jeschke, Sandra Hemme was a patient in a locked ward. She was under the care of doctors. She was, according to her medical records for that week, on 3 separate antipsychotic medications. She was, on the combined cocktail, not always fully oriented to her surroundings. St. Joseph Police nonetheless brought her in for an interview on the afternoon of November 20th, a week after the murder. They had, through means that were never fully documented in the original case file, concluded that she might have information about the Jeschke case. The first detective to try to question her, a man named Fuston, stopped the interview himself. Sandra, he said, did not appear fully sober. She could not focus. She could not follow a simple line of questioning. She was not, in any meaningful sense, in a condition that would allow her to consent to interrogation or to give testimony that a reasonable court would accept. He wrote a note to that effect in her file. He then conducted 7 more sessions with her anyway. Over the course of 8 interrogations in November and December of 1980, Sandra Hemme was removed from the hospital ward, transported to the St. Joseph Police Station, and questioned for periods ranging from 40 minutes to several hours at a stretch. She was restrained to a chair during at least 4 of the sessions. Her medical records indicate that she was kept on her full medication dose during the interrogation period. Under the theory, reasonable in a medical context, catastrophic in a legal one, that disrupting her medication would worsen her underlying condition. The result of maintaining her medication during questioning was that she was, during every one of the 8 sessions, unable to hold her head fully upright without support. She slurred when she spoke. She trailed off mid-sentence. She agreed at various points with statements made by the detectives that she could not, in any documented way, have known to be true. The statements she produced across the 8 sessions did not agree with each other. Each confession contradicted the one before it. The details of the crime she was confessing to changed over the course of those sessions so many times that when Sandra first tried to enter a guilty plea before a judge in March of 1981 in Buchanan County Circuit Court, The judge refused to accept it. The plea, he said, lacked sufficient detail about what had actually happened. He did not understand, on the basis of what she was telling him, how she had known Patricia Jeschke, how she had come to the apartment, or how she had managed to do the things she was confessing to. He sent her back to be questioned further. She was questioned again. She confessed again, this time with different details. The details she offered in this new confession were the ones the detectives had been asking about in the intervening sessions, facts that had been mentioned in her presence over the preceding weeks. She signed the new confession. In the hallway outside the courtroom, before her next appearance, a prosecutor leaned close to her and said something she would repeat to a reporter 45 years later. "If you don't plead guilty," he told her, "you will be dead within 30 days. Sandra Hemme entered a guilty plea she did not understand, to a murder she had not committed, on the promise that doing anything else would kill her. She was sentenced to life in prison. In 1985, the Missouri Court of Appeals ordered a retrial. The appeals court noted, in its written opinion, that Sandra's original plea had been obtained under deeply irregular conditions. The court raised specific concerns about the conditions of her confessions and about the fact that she had not been represented in the early stages of the interrogation process by counsel. The state of Missouri tried her again anyway. She was convicted a second time. Her sentence, handed down by a different judge, was life plus 50 years without the possibility of parole. She was 25 years old. She had been in Missouri state custody for 5 years. She would be in it for another 38. The prison was the Chillicothe Correctional Center. It sat on a gentle rise of land in rural north-central Missouri, 90 miles east of Kansas City. Sandra would live inside its walls for the next 39 years. She spent her 20s in the kitchen of the prison, serving meals to 3 shifts of inmates per day. She spent her 30s doing laundry. In her 40s, she was moved to a clerical position in the prison library, where she remained for the rest of her time. She wrote letters home every week. The letters were short, in the same uneven handwriting that had marked her first Christmas letter in 1980. She wrote to her parents while they were alive. When her mother died in the late 1990s, she wrote to her father alone. She wrote to her sister, who had been a teenager when Sandra was locked up, and who had grown into middle age during the years of the sentence. She watched at a distance as her siblings had children. She kept photographs of her nieces, taped inside the pages of a Bible she had been allowed to keep, and she would take the Bible down from the shelf during her cell time and look at the faces of the children she had never held. Her father, who had told her from the beginning that he believed her, grew old waiting for a court to agree with him. In 2006, at the age of 46, Sandra Hemme wrote a letter to a legal organization she had heard about from another inmate. The organization was called the Innocence Project. It was based in New York City. It specialized in reinvestigating convictions that its lawyers had reason to believe had been wrongly obtained. Her letter asked them to look at her case. She enclosed, as she had enclosed in her many petitions to the Missouri state courts over the years, her own summary of what had happened to her. She offered, in the last paragraph, her medical records and her prison work history. She said that she understood if they could not take her on. She said that she simply wanted someone, somewhere, to read the file. The Innocence Project accepted her case in the summer of 2007. For the next 17 years, lawyers at the Innocence Project worked through the original 1980 case file. What they found, gradually, was a scaffolding of deception so complete that it had taken nearly a generation of investigators to assemble it, and another generation for anyone to realize it had been assembled. They located the FBI hair report from 1981, the report matching the hair on Patricia's bedsheets to Michael Holman, in a folder in the St. Joseph Police Archive. The folder was labeled, in the handwriting of a records clerk who had long since retired, simply the word MISC. The report had been, in any legal sense, hidden from the 1981 defense. They located the records of the Kansas City jewelry store where Holman had tried to use Patricia's credit card. The records confirmed what the witnesses in 1980 had testified to informally, but had never produced in court: that Holman had been at the store with the card on the day Patricia's body was found. This evidence, too, had not reached the 1981 defense. They located Judge Patrick Robb, who had been an assistant prosecutor in St. Joseph in 1980 and had since become a judge in Buchanan County himself. Robb, when asked about the Hemme case in a 2022 interview, said that he had always known Michael Holman was, in his words, connected to the Jeschke case. He had discussed the connection with the defense attorney at the time. The connection had not made it to the trial. In February of 2023, the Innocence Project filed a 100-page habeas corpus petition with the Livingston County Circuit Court. The petition listed, in detailed chronological order, every known failure of the 1980 investigation, every Brady violation by the 1981 prosecution, and every known piece of evidence that had pointed away from Sandra Hemme from the beginning. Judge Ryan Horseman, who would preside over the evidentiary hearing the following year, read the 100-page petition in full before the hearing was scheduled. In January of 2024, the state of Missouri and the Innocence Project argued the case before Judge Horseman across 4 consecutive days of hearings. Sandra Hemme, by then 64 years old, was brought from Chillicothe to the courtroom in Chillicothe for the duration of the hearings. She sat next to her lawyers. She listened to the testimony without visible reaction. Judge Horseman heard from the detectives who had conducted the 1980 interrogations, from former assistant prosecutor Patrick Robb, and from the psychiatric professionals who had treated Sandra in the months before and during her confessions. He reviewed the FBI hair report. He reviewed the store records from Kansas City. He noted, in open court during the 3rd day of the hearings, that Sandra's recorded confessions consisted in large part of monosyllabic answers to leading questions. He asked, during the testimony of one of the original detectives, how that detective could explain the inconsistencies between the various confessions Sandra had signed. The detective did not have an answer. On June 14, 2024, Judge Horseman issued a 118-page written ruling. It concluded that Sandra Hemme was innocent. It concluded that the physical evidence in the case had always pointed to Michael Holman. It ordered Sandra Hemme released from the Chillicothe Correctional Center without further delay. The state of Missouri did not let her go. The Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey, filed emergency motions with the Missouri Court of Appeals and the Missouri Supreme Court seeking to stay Judge Horseman's ruling. Those motions worked their way through the higher courts at a pace that would normally be measured in weeks. A lawyer from Bailey's office, concerned that those motions would not succeed quickly enough, called the warden of the Chillicothe Correctional Center directly. The lawyer instructed the warden not to release Sandra Hemme regardless of what Judge Horseman had ordered. The warden, receiving conflicting instructions from a state judge and from a lawyer at the office of the state attorney general, reported the call to his own superiors. Judge Horseman learned of the call the following morning. He summoned the attorney general's office back to court. He told them on the record that a state agency calling a warden to ignore a sitting judge's release order was not normal legal practice. It was, he said, a form of obstruction. He warned the Attorney General's representatives that he would hold the Attorney General personally in contempt of court, a criminal charge, punishable by a term in the county jail, if Sandra Hemme was not allowed to walk out of Chillicothe Correctional Center within 72 hours. On July 19, 2024, she did. She was 64 years old. She had been in Missouri state custody for 43 years. She had no Social Security credits. She had never owned a cell phone. She had never used the internet. She had not ridden in a passenger car with her family since the Reagan administration. The world outside the prison walls, when she saw it again, bore no resemblance to the one she had left. She walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Center into the arms of the sister who had been writing her letters for decades and the daughter who had been born after she was locked up. Her father, who had told her from the beginning that he believed her, was there to see her walk out. He was 91 years old. He died 10 days later at his home in St. Joseph in the presence of both of his daughters. On December 3, 2024, nearly 6 months after Judge Horseman's original order, the state of Missouri formally dismissed all charges against Sandra Hemme. The 43 years she had spent in prison became, by the judgment of the state itself, the longest known wrongful incarceration of a woman in the history of the United States. The record had previously been held by a woman who had served 34 years. Sandra surpassed it by nearly a decade. In July of 2025, Sandra Hemme filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of St. Joseph and 8 named members of the 1980 St. Joseph Police Department. The complaint ran to 94 pages. It detailed, in factual chronological order, every known act of misconduct that had led to her wrongful conviction. As of the publication of this recording, the lawsuit is active.
Michael Holman, the officer whose credit card use in Kansas City, whose white pickup truck near Patricia's apartment, whose horseshoe earrings in his bedroom drawer, and whose hair evidence matched to Patricia's bedsheets, had pointed at him from the first week of the Jeschke investigation, was never charged for the murder. He was convicted separately of insurance fraud involving his white pickup truck in the late 1980s. He was convicted again, some years afterward, of an armed robbery. He served prison time on the robbery case. In 1989, he was interviewed briefly about the Jeschke murder by a new St. Joseph detective who had come across the case file and had noticed the irregularities. The interview went nowhere. Holman was released. He died in 2015 at the age of 63, 2 years older than Patricia Jeschke had been at the time of her death, if she had lived to reach the same age. Patricia Jeschke died in 1980 at the age of 31. Her killer, according to the factual findings of the 2024 Missouri court ruling, outlived her by 35 years and was never held accountable for what he did to her. Sandra Hemme, who had never met Patricia, who had spent the night of the murder in a locked psychiatric ward under 3 antipsychotic medications, who had been restrained to a chair during interrogations that were supposed to have produced a legally meaningful confession, who had been threatened with death in a courthouse hallway by a man employed by the state of Missouri to represent her case, spent 43 of her own years in a cell because a system that knew who the killer likely was decided in 1980 that it was easier to pick someone else. What Sandra Hemme wrote to her parents on Christmas of 1980 was the truth of the next 4 decades of her life. They wanted somebody. They got her. She walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Center in July of 2024 with $27 in cash, a bag of clothes her sister had brought for her that morning, and a photograph of her father that she had been carrying in her Bible since she had been imprisoned. She was 64 years old. She was finally free. She had just enough time to say goodbye.